Everyone, thank you very much for watching this live event, lesson 33 of the Spring Security Fundamentals stream, and we are starting today the last chapter of the stream, so probably today and one more lesson to end with our Spring Security Fundamentals. Thank you for being here. If you are watching the event live, don't forget that you have a live chat there, so you can ask me questions in the live chat directly. If you are watching the event recorded, you can still ask questions in the comment section, or you can find me on Twitter and LinkedIn and we can discuss there as well. Today I will also at the end leave you another promo code for my book Spring Security in Action. You know the book already, I have it right here, yeah, this is it. So as usual, of course, it's for the ebook, not for the printed book, but as I've done also in the last lessons, I will share with you a promo code, one more promo code to get the Spring Security in Action ebook. What are we discussing today is unit testing. It's actually more than unit testing, it's integration testing with Spring Security. How do you test your security implementations with Spring Security? And this is a really important subject because well, tests in the end are very important. They help you make sure that you don't break something when you implement something new. They represent documentation for your application. At the same time, it's very relevant if you join a new project that's not a new project, it's maybe already written for many years. The unit tests may help you understand better what the functionalities are. At the same time, unit tests help you as a developer write cleaner code, because if you write a messy code, you cannot unit test your code. So there are plenty of reasons for why you want to write unit and integration tests. Not to say that when you work with frameworks like Spring and Spring Security, the changes in versions happen very often, and you don't necessarily want to rely on the framework itself. So when you upgrade the version of your framework, you want to make sure that you don't break something into your application because of, let's say, of something that changed in the framework itself. So yes, there are bugs in the frameworks as well, and there are changes in the frameworks that not necessarily all the time are backwards compatible. So you have to make sure, even though usually the developers working on this, on implementing these frameworks, take care of the backwards compatibility, and they usually take care of implementing bug-free features, they are still humans, so that means that they might still do mistakes. So you want to make sure that when you implement something and you upgrade the version of your dependencies, that you don't break your app. And having unit and integration tests is very helpful. So that's why today we discuss, as the last chapter of this stream, how to write your integration tests for the security implementations you've written with Spring Security, and I hope you'll enjoy this as well. So let me now share you my screen and start with today's lesson. First of all, I want to mention that we will split our discussion into writing tests for authorization and writing the tests for authentication, because usually when you write tests for your Spring Security implementations, you'll mostly focus on the authorization, because the authorizations are generally implemented per use case, which means that if you have an endpoint, you have a specific authorization rule, another endpoint might have a different authorization rule. Or in terms of methods and use cases, when you write a method, say you implement your authorization configurations using global method security, as we discussed in one of the previous lessons. You write some authorization configurations for a specific method, and of course you might have a different set of authorization rules for another method. So that's why you will generally have a lot of tests on authorizations, but not necessarily too many tests on authentication, because the authentication is most of the time you maybe only have one kind of authentication. Say you have an OAuth 2 system and use JWT or any kind of a token, or you use HTTP basic, or you use form login. Maybe sometimes you have more authentication methods, but you will have a couple of methods, maybe 3 authentication methods, so you don't have that many authentication methods, so you don't need that many tests for authentication. So that's why I'd like to focus more on authorization, because the majority of tests you will write for your Spring Security integration with your app are for the authorization configurations you've written. So I have opened my book here. So what you see is the online version of my book, because I wanted to spare some time in discussing again that backbone architecture for authentication and authorization in Spring Security. You already know these classes, these entities, that and the way they are collaborating one with the other in the authentication process, and then of course starting with the authorization filter in the authorization process. But I wanted to remind you the architecture, and then I wanted to discuss with you where does a test fit in this architecture, because what you will see some important things when writing authorization tests, tests for the authorization configurations. You don't go through the whole flow of the authentication. So what you see in gray here, I have shaded here with gray the components that are not touched at all. So in case you write a test that refers to authorization configurations, that test directly works with a mock context. The test creates itself a mock context. I remind you that the security context is that place storing the authentication. So when somebody authenticated, at the end an instance of authentication is stored in the security context, and theoretically the app there uses that security context and the authentication inside the security context, and you have that security context holder that uses a thread local to store multiple authentications per thread in case of a standard web application, of a non-reactive web application, of course. Now, when we test our application, we don't create ourselves the calls. We create mock calls. So instead of having to do the authentication every time, what the test actually does is creating a mock security context, which the test uses, assuming somehow that the authentication worked already. So it only tests the authorization configurations this way, bypassing completely the authentication. That's to allow you write separate tests for authorization and separate tests for authentication. And again, the reason why you want to write separate tests for the authentication and separate tests for authorization is for making your tests faster, because in most cases you will write tests for the authorization configurations, and you don't want each and every test go through authentication as well. So you can write only one test for your authentication method, and then you can write 1,000 tests that are only testing the authorization configurations. It makes a lot of sense, because when you run your unit and integration tests, you want them to be as fast as possible. So you want to avoid just doing some things or testing some things repetitively, and you want to just go directly to what precisely you want to test, and that's what the testing module of Spring Security allows you to do, testing your integration with Spring Security precisely on what you need, the authorization or the authentication. So the tests we are discussing today are only for authorization. Again, I start with authorization because I consider it the most important part. And for these tests, in most of them, everything that's related to authentication is bypassed. So the test creates a mock security context, and it uses that mock security context without authenticating at all the user. And I tell you that from the very beginning, because otherwise when I will explain you on the code, when we'll write the code itself, you might find some of the things to be peculiar, because you will see that you can have a user detail service containing a specific user, say John, but then the test can use a user that's called Mary. And you will say, how is that possible? Because Mary isn't even in my user details service. Well, that's possible because actually the user details service is not used at all. So that Mary you use is just a mock user that will be created in this mock security context that will be used by the test. So it doesn't even matter what you have with your user details service, because that user details service will not be used anyway. And again, if you have some kind of specific logic that is defined by your authentication provider, you remember that the authentication provider is what we use to implement custom authentication logic. Well, that will be bypassed. So it doesn't even matter what you write here, that will be bypassed. When you write authorization tests, everything that's related to authentication is bypassed. And I will show you that there is a possibility to also use the user details service at some point, and I will tell you when is that needed. But in general, when you write authorization tests or tests for your authorization configurations, then what's authentication is bypassed. So don't be tricked by the fact that you might have a specific user in your user details service but the tests still work, is because the authentication is bypassed. So let me now show you some code. So I didn't create a project yet. I will just start by creating a new project, Spring Initializer, and we will call it Spring Security. I think this is course 33. It doesn't really matter which Java version are you using, but generally I'm either using the latest long-term supported or the latest version. So let's try with 15. And of course we want to have some kind of an application that we can test. Of course, we'll just create a very simple hello world endpoint, and we will then focus on how to write the tests for that endpoint, because for our example here, it doesn't really matter how complex is the business behind the endpoint. Then of course, when you have a real application, you will test all the possible inputs and all the possible outputs, and not necessarily all the possible, but all the relevant possible inputs and all the relevant possible outputs. But that's your business, and that's anyway different for each and every application. But technically, what I will present you here is what you will use no matter of what kind of business are you testing. So we just have to create a web app, and of course, because we discuss the security implementation still and testing security implementations, we need to add Spring Security to our dependency list. And because we only want a very simple app for our demonstration, then it's enough if we just add these two dependencies to create an endpoint and secure it. So I created, and I will wait just a few seconds for my IntelliJ here to completely finish the indexing of the dependencies. And then I can just step into my application by writing that very simple controller I will use for my demonstration. So what I need to do is, for the moment, just create a controller. So I create my controllers package, and inside it I will create a say demo controller, and that's only a very simple REST controller, of course, with a very simple method say demo that returns a string. And we can just also assign a path to our controller. So you already know that if I would start now this application and I would try to test the endpoint using a postman, Spring Security configures a default user details service which contains a user and a password that is written all the time. Every time we start the application is written in the console. So I can just start the application. We won't call it directly because I'm now stepping afterwards directly into the unit tests. But I want to start the application again so that you remember that when you only have the Spring Security dependency in your POM XML and you write an endpoint, then automatically, because you have the Spring Security dependency, your Spring Boot project will pre-configure an user details service and the password encoder. So you know you have the user and the password that is every time written in the console. Now, how do we write and what do we expect when writing an integration test for our endpoint you see here? Whenever you write, of course, a test, you have in your Maven project to go directly to the test folder, and here automatically when creating a Spring Boot project using the Start Spring IO service will also create a unit test for you. By the way, if you take a look into the POM XML, you will also see that besides the normal couple of dependencies, you already know you've added the web and the Spring Security dependency. You will as well see that Spring Boot, actually the Start Spring IO created the Spring Boot with another couple of dependencies which we didn't discuss up to now because it wasn't the point to discuss it at that time, but they are related to the testing your application, to writing unit and integration tests for your application. So here it is, the one that enables you JUnit Jupyter and all the other related dependencies for writing unit and integration tests with JUnit Jupyter, which is considered to be the convention for Spring Boot. And because you have also added the Spring Security dependency, you will see that your project has been automatically created using this Spring Security test dependency. Both of these are in the test scope, which is normal because you won't use them at the runtime, which also tells you it's easier to see this way that both dependencies are related to writing unit and integration tests. So that's why I don't even need to add more dependencies to what I already have to my project, because Start Spring IO took care of adding the needed dependency in my Spring Boot project when I have created the project. Now, I would like to, however, let's refactor this, because I would like to have more classes. I will show you more fashions in which you can implement your integration tests with Spring Security. So for each way of writing your integration test, I would like to have a separate class, because afterwards, as you know, I will commit all this project and all my everything that I write in my GitHub account, and you'll be able to access it and you'll be able to test it yourself. So let me know, this is example1 tests file, I will call it, and then all the other files will be example2, example3, and so on, depending on how many we'll need to write. And the first thing I'd like to tell you is that usually when you write an API, an app exposing REST endpoints, REST APIs, and you secure it with Spring Security, you know and you remember from our previous discussions in the previous lessons that we've separated the authorization configurations at the endpoint level and at the method level. So that's precisely the way you need to think about them in terms of writing integration tests, because you will now have the cases in which you want to write your integration tests for your endpoints, and then you will probably want to mock calls to your endpoints using, I prefer to use mock MVC for this, so I can just say here auto configure mock MVC, and that will automatically add in the Spring Boot will be smart enough to add in the context a bin of type mock MVC that I will be able to use for my testing. So I can just auto wire it here and use it. When using mock MVC, you perform calls directly on the endpoints, which allows you to test your endpoint configurations. And that's the first way of writing your tests for your security configurations, by testing the calls to the endpoints directly, which is something I consider really important and mandatory when you have REST endpoints, REST APIs in your app. You need to write your integration tests on the controllers using a tool like mock MVC to perform mock calls to your endpoints. That's mandatory. Why is that mandatory? Is because the client, the real client, that's what will do it. The real client won't call a specific method in your app. It will call an endpoint, and that endpoint is mapped to a specific method. So calling the endpoint, making sure that you write integration tests on the endpoints when you have REST APIs, it allows you to write clear tests in which you identify with your client, with the client of your app, and this way you test precisely what the client expects, or what you presume the client expects to happen when they call a specific endpoint. So that's why when you write REST endpoints, this is not necessarily a lesson for unit tests. I will maybe create later a specific stream only on unit and integration tests, because that's a really different epic there. You have a lot of things to discuss. There are plenty of books already only on how to write unit and integration tests. So I can say now I will make you an expert in writing unit and integration tests with these couple of lessons. We are still discussing only integration tests for Spring Security, but I will tell you some things that are very relevant, and one of them is always when you have REST APIs, keep in mind, write your integration tests for your controllers, not only unit tests. Sometimes you don't even need to write unit tests, but the integration tests on controllers in such applications are really important, and from my perspective, I would say they are mandatory. So that's why I'm showing you how to do this with mock MVC, which is precisely what I consider to be mandatory. So let me say I would like to test demo endpoint, test authenticated, authenticated, or first unauthenticated, it's easier. Demo endpoint. And one more thing, folks, when you write a unit test, never write a method that is longer than what you can see on a screen. I've seen this anti-pattern a lot with people using underscores and things like this just to separate and make some kind of a description out of the name of the method itself, which is wrong. The name of the methods written for your unit and integration tests, they don't necessarily need to tell themselves the story. They must be as short as possible. When you want to tell the story of what your test is doing, use a display name. So here you say, when calling the demo endpoint without authentication, we expect, and then what you expect, to get a 401 probably unauthorized. So when you write the definition of your test, do it with a display name, not via the method name, because I've seen this in real world applications where people started to give these kinds of long names that were actually impossible to read. You couldn't even read that method name. So that's an anti-pattern. You just have to write a short name, not necessarily very descriptive for your method name, but describe it accurately with the display name. I won't now use further the display name, but that's for your real world scenarios. Do that. It's really important. And now what we want to do, we want to use mock MVC to call and test in a description here that when I call the endpoint without authorization, without authentication, then that shouldn't actually work. So we should have back a status of 401 unauthorized in this case. So what we say perform a get for the demo endpoint and expect the status to be and I never understood why for my, so that's okay, yeah, I can import it, but sometimes my IntelliJ doesn't know what to import and where from, which is quite strange because I actually used an ultimate IntelliJ, so I expect I would have expected for it to know where to import this from, but yeah, I guess that IntelliJ has also some dark sides. So let's see, let's add this ourselves. So what I'm doing here, I have to statically import the get method, which, if I remember correctly, is in the servlet request mock MVC builders. Does it work like this? Yeah, it works. And then we have the perform method, which throws an exception, so that's not a problem. Not a try catch. I would like to actually throw it outside because we don't care for the exception here, so we can actually throw it outside. And here's the only line testing my demo endpoint. theoretically now, because I have no authentication, whenever mock MVC will call my demo endpoint, we expect the status to be unauthorized. And let me run my unit test and see that it passes, and we should see a green light here in case everything is as expected. And you again see also that very nicely you don't see the method name here now because you use the display name. You see a very nice description of your test. That's why I'm telling you, whenever you need to describe your test, don't use the test name for that, the test method name for that. Use a display name annotation and describe nicely what your test does here. This is what will appear on the reports. Well, this is what will appear on your Jacoco reports afterwards when you run it in a pipeline. So it's absolutely amazing. You don't need to use big, large method names, descriptive method names for your tests. You just need to use a nice description on the display name. Cool. But now, what happens when I will try to actually do the other way around? I will try to have an authenticated test. So now I want to test what happens when my call to the demo endpoint is authenticated. And of course, in this case, I expect when it's authenticated to have a status of OK. And in a real world scenario, you have to test many more things. Of course, you have to test the body in case you have a body of the response. You have to test the headers in case you have headers on the response. So so when I now run my application, my test here, it won't of course work. It will fail because, as you have seen, by running it just like this, well, the status of the response is basically unauthorized, is not okay. So if I run this now, it will tell me, well, it's not authorized, it's not okay, it's actually unauthorized. That's what you will see if you run the test. Let me show you. I'm running now the test. You see the test now and should see a red color here. Perfect. So you've seen a red, yellow, red, depending on what are you doing. So you see, indeed, the response had a 401, and we said we are expecting for a 200 OK, but it was actually 401, which is, of course, something we expected. But how do we instruct now our integration test to send an authentication? Well, we can use, we have multiple fashions in which we can do that, as I've told you. Today I will show you some of them. In the next lesson I will show you some other ways of writing the test. So in today and in the next lesson, probably the next lesson will be the last lesson of the stream, we'll discuss all these possible ways. So the first one, which we are interested in, is using with mock user. What with mock user does is creating where is my book? Here is my book. Is creating a mock security context, and inside the mock security context, it simply adds an instance of authenticated authentication that the test will use. So be attentive again, it doesn't authenticate at all, it doesn't go through the authentication flow, it directly inserts in a mock security context a mock user that the test uses, considering that the user somehow did already pass the authentication. So that's why I wanted to show you first this diagram, which is really important. So do you understand now that we are simply only testing the authorization? Because doing this, and I will show you, so you remember which is now the user that we can use to call the endpoint is called user. I can even give here the username Mary, Bill, John. Do we have such a user in our application? No, we didn't even create a user detail context. We are still relying on that default user detail service. Spring Security Spring Boot actually configured us. So there is no Mary in our application. But still, even if it's no Mary in our application, this will work, because what will happen is Spring Security will actually create the user Mary in a mock security context and will use the test only for testing the authorization rules. And by default, if you remember, the authorization that the only authorization configurations that we have by default configured by Spring Security is having the user authenticated. So that's why now my test is passing, because it doesn't even matter how you name your user here. It's just a mock user in a mock security context that is used by my app for testing the authorization configurations, which is great, because I don't have to, every time I write a unit test, or say integration test in this case, I don't have to rely on every time also authenticating a user, because that will mean I will lose a lot of time in the running process of my pipeline. Instead of having it in, I don't know, just a couple of seconds, it will take more. Depending on the number of tests, if I have 1,000 tests, it might take double the time, which is an important time. Okay, so now let's actually also create a user details service, so we can have a real user in our application. We will demo again that even if we create a different user, like I will name it John, for example, my test using Mary will still work. So that way I will make sure you understand, I make sure you actually understood that indeed the user details service is not used in running my tests for the authorization. And then I will show you what happens if you have some different authorization rule, like for example you take into consideration the role of or the authority of your user. How can you write a test that verifies different authorization configuration, let's say more complex. I wouldn't say complex, because what I will show you is not complex, but it's the same as any other more complex authorization rule that you would define. So let me create here my config package very fast, and inside the config package write my project config class. This is configuration. And then you know that you need to create a user details. By the way, if this is the first time you are here with me, I'm just showing you this very fast because this is lesson 33 of the stream. So we have already discussed basically everything, and you can find them on this channel. You can find them the recordings, and you can watch them in case this is completely new for you, because otherwise you won't understand them. So if you are completely new to Spring Security, my recommendation for you is, first of all, you can watch it's free to watch any video on this channel. So you have 33 lessons already on this channel to watch, 33 nice hours of Spring Security detailed with examples. And secondly, if you want to use a nice book, you can get my Spring Security in Action, which details in 560 pages, again, a lot of nice things you need to know for your Spring Security knowledge. Yeah, I was actually creating a user here in meanwhile, so I'm saying with username John, different than Mary, okay, with some password. We don't even care about the password now. With some, say, authorities, we need to have at least an authority, and then I build my user here, and then I make sure I use it. I add it to my, it's actually in memory user details manager implementation, which is my user details service. So U1. And I need to also specify a password encoder, and as usual for my examples, I'm using that no-op password encoder, which is marked as deprecated because you shouldn't use it in a real world scenario, but it's great for your examples. Like in this case, you don't have to actually hash your password. You can just leave it in plain text because it's only an example. In a real world application, you should never do that. That's why it's crossed out here. That's why the no password encoder is marked as deprecated, so you know you shouldn't use it. And I will prove it again to you that even though now I have created a user details service which contains a user, the user is named John, I can still run my test with Mary, because this with mock user annotation, this is actually creating a new user in a mock security context. So that's why don't expect that the username should somehow in this case match with something that exists in the app, because it doesn't need to. This is completely skipping the authentication. You use it only to test the authorization. Okay, so it's still working. So that's first of all. But what what should you do when you have a more complex authorization configuration? Like for example, what happens here if I extend the web security configurer adapter and override the configure method? Where is it? Here it is. So yeah, basic, we don't actually care what kind of authentication method we use now, because we discuss only the authorization tests, but we care about which are the authorization, endpoint authorization configurations. So you remember to write the endpoint authorization configurations, you just write HTTP authorized requests, and then you specify which are the requests you want to secure. In my case, I only have an endpoint anyway, so I can say any request. I would like that any request for successfully calling my endpoint, the user should have the authority read. So what can I do in this case to test my application? Well, if you run the test again, if you run this test again, which previously was working, now I expect it won't work anymore. Why? Because now it's more than being authenticated. My user needs to be authorized and will be authorized only if it has the proper authority, because that's what I've written here. See, any request should have the authority read. So now it's not enough to be a user. It needs to be a user with a specific authority, and if it's not, and in our case this with mock user creating the user Mary doesn't add the proper authority, that's why my test is now failing with a forbidden status actually. So in my case I can say test authenticated without proper authority, or without the right authority. Let's leave it like this, and then we expect the status to be is forbidden. In this case, that's what will work. In case I'm running it now, I expect now it will work, because the forbidden status is what I expect it will be back when I didn't when I use a user that is that doesn't have the right authority. So here it is, and now you see it's actually working. And then I want to add my test as well to validate that when you have a user with the right authority, it actually works. So then I create a second test that I call with proper. Don't forget, always use the display name in real world example. So never write long method names to describe the test, always use a display name, okay? I'm now sparing time by writing the display name, but in a real world scenario, I'm always writing my display name. So what you will see is that you can actually specify the authorities or roles here, and you can say this one has the authority read. So by default, if you take a look into the with mock user annotation, you see by default that you don't have any authority. The user is created with a role named user. You can alter that. You can add more roles. You can write different role, or you can write different authorities for your user by using one of these methods. So to do so, you just add the proper attribute on your annotation, and now when you run it, oh, I forgot to change the status. My test will fail now, because now actually I have provided the right user, so I expect that my status is okay, not forbidden. Forbidden was here where I didn't have the right authority, while in case of this method it will actually be okay. So I should have written is okay in this case for my test to pass. So I've changed my expectation to is okay. I'm rerunning the test, and I see that indeed my last test is working as well, and I'm this way validating that my authority configurations are right. So what is the proper way to test the custom method in pre-authorize? I'm going to use that as well, so no worries. I'm just starting now with the endpoint authorization, and then the next subject that we discuss in this chapter is how to test your global method security. I'm not going to answer now to your question, because it will be one of the next things, It might be not today, but in the next lesson, because we don't have a lot of time today, unfortunately. But I will. I'm promised to answering you to this question as well. So this is actually I'm taking the approach the same way I've taken it in my book here. You see, I'm discussing here about how to test the endpoint authentication, and if you go down below, you will see that afterwards I've shown you how to use. Here it is somewhere. I'm also showing you how to test your global method security. I think it's more down below. Here it is. See? No, not this one. Sorry. Yeah, here it is. So here is this name service. Basically, in my application has some global method security, some pre and post authorize, and then I'm writing tests for that. You will basically see that you can use the same annotations for that, but I will just write the examples when we get to that point. But yes, you can, and yes, you should always test your services where you have configured your authorization rules on the method level. Good. So now, still on the endpoint authorization configurations, with mock user is not the only way you can write your authorization configurations. What I'm going to do now, on the same application, I'm going to copy paste this example, and I will show you a different way of writing the tests, and we'll discuss when you'll use that one instead of the one we have just seen with mock user. The second way in which you'd like to write the tests is using the with user details annotation. So what's different in using the with user details is that now you can provide a specific user details bin instead of leaving Spring Security create your instances for you. You give Spring Security the users by providing it with a user details implementation. So of course, in my case, if I don't do any kind of other magic, and I won't do, I have already added a bin of the user details service type, which is this one in my app. So what happens is that because this one will be the one found in the context, the Spring Security test will find that one, and then what I'm going to tell it is that I want it to take the user John, and actually what you see is that John, in my case, it actually has the authority read, so I can do another way around. I can actually create a second user here, Bill, which has a different authority, right? And of course I have to add both of these in my user details service. And now with user details, Bill should be forbidden because Bill is now precisely this user from the user details service, and Bill doesn't have the needed authority to call the endpoint. But when I say with user details John, then this one should be is okay, because indeed in my user details service John has the right authority to read to call the endpoint, which is read, of course. So now I can run the tests again in this setup, and you will see the same thing. You see I'm actually testing the same thing. The only difference from the tests I've written in example 1 and in example 2 is that in example 1 I'm creating mock users. In example 2 I'm using a user details service that is configured in my application. And what is that allowing me? Well, in a real world example, you won't actually use the same user details as of your app. You will probably create a different user details service that's working only for the test profile. So it's only working for tests, for writing for your unit tests. And you can this way just take the users from somewhere. For example, for your test, you can instruct you can instruct Spring Security to take your user details from a database or from a specific endpoint. Be very careful, however, it's not necessarily recommended to use an external resource. So I could say using an internal database might be a good choice in some cases, but don't, from my point of view, don't do the mistake of using an external database or an external endpoint. Why? Because network is unreliable. Network is not 100% reliable, which means that at some point you will have a situation in which your unit or integration tests will fail in your pipeline just because for some networking problem they won't be able to call the database. That's why I never recommend someone to write unit and integration tests that use the network, which means going to an external resource, using an external dependency that the tests need to call through an endpoint like a database, for example. So be careful with that. Just take that into consideration. I'm not going into more details now, but technically I think you understood what with user details does and what is it different from with mock user. So with mock user you don't have a user details, it automatically creates a security context with this user and it uses it as it would have been authenticated already. In case of the user with user details, it doesn't authenticate still, but it takes the users to be used for authorization from a user details service, which allow you in some cases more flexibility in like using some real users from somewhere. In some cases you need that. So you might need to have something like more detailed users stored in a local database, like in an in-memory database, and then you use that one. So with user details give you the flexibility, gives you the opportunity of using user details to get the user you need for your tests. And to prove you that these are real users, these are indeed the users you have configured here, just try to put a Mary again here. So guess what will happen for Mary? It will actually tell you that Mary doesn't exist. Yeah. So in this case, Mary won't work at all because with user details really expects that Mary is a user provided by that user details service. So what you will see here is that when you'll call your test with a different user, with a username that is not one of the users of your user details service that you are using, then of course it will fail, and it will say it failed to create the mock security context just because you have provided a value that wasn't found in the user details. So again, when you use with user details, it doesn't simply create the user as it was happening here, where you didn't actually care what was the username. In a lot of cases, actually in my case, in most of the cases, I don't even add here the username because I don't care. Usually I don't have authorization rules based on the username, so I don't even care what's the name of the user. So you can actually just leave it like this and it will still work without any problem. So I've simply added here the username just to help you understand what happens behind the with mock user. But in a real world scenario, you'd probably never even give a username to this user because it's irrelevant. Sometimes it's relevant to provide the authorities, but the username? Do you ever actually use a right authorization configuration based on the username? Most probably not. So in case you don't, then of course you don't want to spare just some text, write some text for nothing there. You prefer to leave out all the boilerplate code you can, so you won't even add a username here. But in this case, well, you actually need a username because with user details needs to find the username from somewhere. It needs to find the username from that specific user details service that you create. And the third and the last way of writing the tests, I will actually leave it for the next lesson because we don't have time for it now, and I would prefer to spare my last 5 to 10 minutes with giving you that promo code and not forget about that. Again, I promise you in the next lesson we discuss also about using the tests on the pre-authorized and post-authorized. So I didn't forget about that. I won't forget about this. I will discuss that in the next lesson together with the third way of writing the unit tests. You will see that you can mock completely the security context. I will show you how to completely create your own mock test security context, and then we go from the authorization configurations written on the endpoint to the authorization configurations written at the method level. We discussed the authorizations for the method level, which you will see they are more or less the same thing. You just that you will, instead of using mock MVC, you can auto wire directly the instance you test. And then we go even further and we discuss the authentication, testing the authentication of your application, and that will basically be everything we want to discuss about the Spring Security fundamentals in this stream. Now the promo code. Sorry for taking you that long with my description. So again, I will share you another 100% promo code. So the possibility to get your Spring Security in Action ebook for free. Yeah, I'm sure you will make use of these 560 pages I've written of nice examples of Spring Security. What you need to do is just enter the Manning website. I shared you the link in the live chat. You press to buy, add to cart the Spring Security in Action, and then you press to buy it, but instead of paying for it, you will just insert the promo code I'm giving you now, and when you will press apply the promo code, it will decrease your price to 0. So you will pay, basically you will be able to take it for free. You don't need to pay for it. Of course, this promo code I'm sharing with you now is only usable once, so only the first of you who will use the code will be able to take the ebook. It's only for the ebook, so you have to buy the ebook, not the printed book. The code doesn't work at all for the printed book. And what I wanted to say again is that make sure that if you don't need the ebook or you already have it, then leave the others who need it to have the book. I'm sure a lot of people want to have this book, so if you already have it, you don't need to use the promo code anymore. So don't use it. Just leave the others have the book. Because they for sure need it, and there are people wanting to have the book. Thank you very much for that. I'm glad that you got the book already. So on how to apply HTTP session for a couple of endpoints. HTTP session is not something directly related to Spring Security, isn't it? So no, I didn't actually discuss about HTTP session. What I can tell you is that you might find something relevant about HTTP session in one of the chapters in Spring in Action. I might also write something about HTTP session in chapter 7 and 8 of the Spring Quickly, which is the second book I write. But only in Spring Security in Action, I only written the very important things you need to know about Spring Security. So I focused on Spring Security, not on web applications directly. So that's why you will find the relevant things about Spring Security, but not everything about web apps. That would have been impossible for me to write. It's anyway 560 pages, and I could have written a little bit more, but the editors didn't allow me write more, because I was actually already going over 700 pages if I wanted to include everything I wanted to include in the book. But in the next edition, I promise to include even more, and I will refer to the first edition for what I exclude. So yeah, I was actually sharing you the promo code. Sorry for that. So you have to enter the promo code. And by the way, if you like the book, if you already have the book, if you like it, especially, it really helps me if you give me some nice 5 stars reviews. So on both Manning or Amazon, if you have bought the book from Amazon, and not necessarily, you can actually review the book on Amazon even if you didn't buy the book from Amazon. Anyway, if you read the book and you liked it, leave that nice 5-star reviews here. It really helps me for promoting the book, and you will help others as well find about it and read it. And I'm pretty sure it's valuable information there. It's dozens of valuable information with a lot of code examples that are working. I had people testing my codes before I have released them, so I'm pretty sure you will find a lot of great content there. Super. So is this last class in this series? No, it's not the last one. I think it will be one more. So the next one we discuss the authorization on the method, testing the authorization on the method level, and then testing the authentication. Most probably the next lesson will be the last one. I will still continue to answer your questions. I will still be here. I will just start another stream soon. Probably most probably the next stream will be one on software architectures, because a lot of people asked me to do so. And then I will also share recorded individual videos on Spring Security wherever a more complex answer is required for a question you leave. So I won't record them live, I won't have live lessons anymore on this subject, but I will still discuss on this subject on my YouTube channel. And of course you know that that I'm going to discuss a lot of other subjects as well. I already have discussed other subjects, so stay tuned, because you will still find a lot of nice content on this channel. I'm working a lot to make this channel the best resources in video tutorials for the Java ecosystems, from the very beginner to expert and professionals. Thank you very much for watching this live event, and stay tuned for new videos. Have a great